what's new with Sitecore PowerShell Extensions 6.4. Um, I think the last few years, the development of new big features has slowed down a little bit, but I think that demonstrates the stability of the module, and also demonstrates that we're moving things forward along with as Sitecore, the platform evolves. We are making sure that it's up to date and supports some of the newer, bigger, better features. I want to thank this user group for the opportunity to share my experiences, and I hope many of you find it helpful, and I do appreciate any feedback following the presentation. If there's any ideas that you may have, you're welcome to share that in Sitecore Slack or on Twitter or the GitHub issues for the module, and I'll cover a little bit more of that as we move forward. Once again, today we're talking about SPE 6.4. It's not yet released, but I imagine it will sort of roll out as Symposium is right around the corner, and Sitecore releases their new versions. We release SPE. All right. A huge shout out to all the sponsors supporting the SPE development through GitHub. I really do appreciate it. The money that comes in through the sponsorship helps to renew tools such as Snagit, Camtasia, which is a screen casting software, and then any of the recording equipment or any hardware that I need to do some of the development. If you are interested in supporting SPE, either as an individual or a group, you're welcome to visit the sponsor link, which you can see down below. Many of the repositories that I maintain will have the little sponsor button with a little heart on it. There's no long-term commitment required. If you're just interested in a one-time, hey, I want to, buy you some iced tea or a drink, that's perfectly fine as well. Several of the sponsors have actually been sponsoring since the beginning, and I find that to be amazing. Cool community to be part of. Yeah, so brief overview of the material for today. So I'll start off with some helpful resources to get started with Sitecore PowerShell extensions, and to just sort of guide to walk you along in your use of the module, and some security improvements in the module, which is really going to be the focus of today's session. And then I'll just briefly speak about the packages that come with the item as resources support. There may be some confusion about the various packages of the module, and so I'd like to make sure that you know which one to install in your scenario. All right. So once again, the first and best place um, to find documentation for the module is the official documentation site. I maintain it through a product called Gitbook, but there is a GitHub repository in which you can do pull requests for the documentation. So if you find a problem with a particular page, I think just the other day, a member of this user group shared that there was a broken link. Microsoft changed the link to some documentation, and so I went ahead and fixed that. But if there's anything in here, any particular page, if you find that some of the organization of it is a bit confusing, you're welcome to share that feedback. But it's mostly stable. It hasn't changed its structure in I think a couple years now. Mostly just enhancing the material that's there. But with the material in today's presentation, I'll no doubt be adding new pages for that. One other comment is there's a training tab in the documentation. I like to share that to those that are new to PowerShell scripting, it can be a bit overwhelming, especially if maybe you're um, a junior C# developer and you're like, oh, great, now I got to learn PowerShell. The training page has some examples at what syntax would look like in C# and what that conversion looks like in PowerShell. Um, but as I've said in other presentations, there is so much that comes with PowerShell extensions, the module, that you may find yourself using it and rarely writing scripts, just taking advantage of the existing capabilities. And the script writing just really becomes useful when you say, hey, there's a tool I want to build and it doesn't exist. Let me go experiment. And once again, if you've got questions or comments, the Sitecore Slack chat is a great place. I spend a lot of time there. I monitor this channel as best as I can. And if you've got questions and it's something I think I can help out or I'm available, then I'll certainly jump in and give you some pointers. Sometimes I'll share news there. You should see, if you're in the channel, notifications with code commits. So if you want to follow along, say, oh, this new feature is coming up, what was this issue that you're working on? You'll see the notifications appear in the channel. There's a GitHub integration with Slack. And finally, in terms of places to find resources for the module, on the Sitecore Stack Exchange, there's a tag, PowerShell-extensions. Most of the questions are going to be tagged this. If you're asking a question and it relates specifically with the module, it would be helpful if you use that appropriate tag. There is a general PowerShell tag, but that could apply to a script installing Solar, and which would have nothing to do with the module, this module. And so using PowerShell extensions is a good way to find the right audience. um, yeah. All right. Oh, it looks like a little header, little animation problem there. So I'd say there's probably two or three primary security changes that are taking place with this module. Um, the the one that I'd like to present on today is related to delegated access. But the other two, and I'll speak a little bit more about delegated access, but the other two are more around um, enhancements to the UI that reduce information disclosure or reduce the risk that someone using SPE will inject scripts into dialogues and things like that. And so while I've pointed out a couple of those issues, I've been working closely with the SXA team and Sitecore to make sure that anything that they think is of interest, of concern, any recommendations that they're making. They have security engineers test their product, and so if they think, hey, we could make improvements to SPE, then they pass that along to the SXA team. And Alan, you may be familiar with Alan. He and David work along with Adam Naimonovich, and he shares with me, hey, this is what security brought up. What do you think about it? You probably would have seen other things like elevated the elevated state. Whenever you log in and you're trying to use the console or the ISE, or you create a script, create a PowerShell script item, and it says, oh, you need to elevate your session. That was really a result of Sitecore making suggestions or recommendations, and then we come back and say, how could we improve both the um, experience for developers, but also prevent this sharp tool from kind of scratching everybody. um, you know this is an evolution of us doing those kinds of improvements. So once again, today we're going to talk about delegated access. As I mentioned, there's a few security improvements made in this release. They're really around the UI. And so we're focusing on something called delegated access. This may be known by other names, but none of them sound as clear and concise as this. And I came up with a very basic description. Um, and so this comes to mind: provide the ability to grant users elevated access for specific scripts exposed through the context menu, the ribbon, and report actions. So what's the problem with how things work now? Well, in each of the integration points that I mentioned, context menu, ribbon, and report action, these scripts currently execute as the logged in user, otherwise known as the context user. So if you've written any C# um, integrations for Sitecore, like a pipeline, gutter, anything where there's this context user at play, like does the user have read access or write access? Um, well, if Michael has access to read the item, but he can't alter the item, then some of these integrations might not work the way that I want them to work. So maybe this button is available, but if I didn't have certain access, well, then all of a sudden the button becomes kind of useless to me. And and so what we want to do is we want to provide a convenient way for an administrator to both give access to these integrations or scripts exposed to the UI and increase the access to those capabilities, not normally available to the user or role. And we'll go through some examples to demonstrate the issue. If you've spent any time with Windows PowerShell remoting, so if we kind of step aside from a Sitecore conversation, say just looking at Windows PowerShell, they have something called WinRM, which is their um, remoting protocol. I guess would be the right way to say it. And with WinRM, with Windows PowerShell remoting, you're able to constrain endpoints that you connect to. So it's called constrained endpoints. So I can initiate PowerShell commands with a remote system, and I might not be, let's say, a domain administrator, but if I remotely connect to a machine and this constrained endpoint has been configured, I might be granted additional access on that machine. I'm not able to, add users, but maybe I'm able to go delete log files or something, but I'm not able to RDP into the machine. I'm just able to run whatever they give me access to. And so, considering that kind of idea, that kind of approach, we want to translate that into the Sitecore context. How can I give someone the ability to go do something that they would normally do, but in a way that I don't give them, the keys to the kingdom. They can't go do everything, but they can go do this one task, and it operates in a way that goes above and beyond their abilities as a in terms of access. So we'll go through some examples of that, and so time for the demo. Uh, and if you've got any questions, be sure to put those in the chat, and and the leaders of the group will share those questions with me as we move along. So hopefully, okay, so I'm logged in. I'm logged in as Michael West, and I am um, a content editor in this particular role. And so content editors, they don't get a whole lot. I've gone logged into the desktop view, but if you went to the Launchpad, you'll see that there's not a lot of options. So we'll go to the desktop because that demonstrates most of what I would like to share today. You can see content editor, and I've got a reporting tools. One comment to make about the reporting tools for SPE 6.4, I've changed the required role to see this menu, PowerShell Reports, from the Sitecore client maintaining role to the Sitecore client authoring role. And the reason is because most of the reports that we've previously had here were had some sort of access to things that you wouldn't normally have access to. And so in, I don't know if it was 6.2, but one of the previous releases, I restricted those reports, and I restricted some of the tools to only users in a particular role. And so now that I've pulled it back and said, well, what you could see today is something that's really just a view only, then there shouldn't really be a concern. Also, but changing the role, it lowers the barrier to entry on seeing the reports. So brand new installation, you want to assign editors to go log in and see reports, you'd have to go modify the security on this PowerShell reports item in the core database. So it's just a kind of like an unnecessary step. So lowering the access requirements to someone that's an author, which does include developers, then you can see it right away. And so now we can have more people using the reports. And certainly you can go change that back to the default or the original way if you like. But for now, we'll just say that it makes sense to give access to more users for the reporting. So we can see here that there's a certain number of reports that are available out of the box. You can see that there's a content audit, a media audit, and a rules-based report, which I've recorded a session in the past. It's basically using kind of a little configuration to say this is the report, but doesn't require scripting. You're really just configuring items, and then it produces a report for you. So it's kind of neat, but I'm not sure how many people are using it, but it is, I find it to be useful. So we've got these, you can see that there's a custom report section. This is a report section that has no restrictions on how it appears. And so you can see that I can view the custom reports, but ideally this would be restricted to particular roles, maybe a particular user if you only want that one user, but generally the roles would be sufficient. So what I want to do is I want the ability to unlock an item. Um, so you can see that admin has locked this home page. And the part that's frustrating is that the admin might be on vacation in Galveston, Texas. And we don't want to get on a phone call and force the admin to log in from their phone or whatever, go to some internet cafe to try and correct the issue. You want to be able to delegate this access to someone else, someone you trust, someone who maybe is like a manager of all the editors, right? So maybe someone who's the team lead, maybe they're um, distributing out the work and saying, "Hey, I need I need Rebecca to go make content changes to the homepage." And the admin locked it by mistake. Admin's not available. What are we going to do? So what we want to do is to create a button that it appears up here that I can click on, or as a warning, right? So a little content editor warning that lets you do something extra. Okay, so we're going to go to um, System Modules. Now you can see I'm logged in as administrator. And if you're curious why all of a sudden Sitecore looks weird or different, it's because I'm using a Chrome extension, the Sitecore Author Toolbox, and that kind of beautifies the experience. And so um, I'm gonna take advantage of that so that you can see when things look a little bit different. I'm switching accounts. Because I'll be going between two different browsers. So I'm currently logged in as an administrator, And in the modules tree, there's the PowerShell section, which you all have come to know and love. There is a new section called Delegated Access, and so we're going to spend some time having a look at this. But to take a step back, a few releases ago, I rolled out the elevated unlock feature. So if you go to SPE, and I think it's under Tools, Security Management, there are two different features that are available here. And one is nested under the ribbon, and the other one is nested under the warning. A comment here is that when you're using these integration points, whether it be the ribbon, the context menu, the warning, there is a naming convention. There's a pattern that you follow, and you can use this insert options for integration point libraries. There's a wizard that runs that creates the tree for you. You can certainly do it manually, and once again, it's based on the name. So ribbon has to be spelled RIBBON, and so forth, in order for these things to function properly. And in some cases, like the ribbon, you're going to need to run the rebuild script integration points. That can be found in the toolbox. It can also be found in the ISE on there's a tab, I think it's settings tab, where you can rebuild integration points. That's done because there are certain things in the Sitecore UI that require item creation in the core database. And so when you run that wizard, it generates those items for you and cleans up ones that don't exist. So that's another big topic, and we can certainly cover that if time permits or in another session. So we've got these elevated unlock. If you go look at scripting, you can see that they're very basic in nature. Go get a particular script item and then run it. This is intended for reusability. So you'll see that also appears slightly different. It's the same ID, so we can see that there's a BD07 and BD07 appears right here. So we're going to get the script, but between a ribbon and the warning, content editor warning, integration point, they operate differently. So when you click a button here, it will just go execute the command. When you run the warning, you need to create like a link that appears on the screen, and so it's kind of weird, but they're different, and there's examples for you to follow on how to do this. This is an example you could follow if you were trying to create your own content editor warning and you wanted to have a script execute when the user clicks a link. Yeah, so we've got this ribbon button and we've got this warning. I need to be able to make both of these appear for the appropriate users. So if you go click on the interactive section, each of these have rules associated with it. If you look in the documentation there's a integration points section, talks about the differences between the show rule and the enable rule. Some integrations use both, some use just one. Is really around the context in which, like, are we, like in the case of a ribbon, you can make them visible but disabled, where the warning is just there or it's not, right? So you'll notice that on the warning, there's just an enable rule. So it's like, hey, just enable it or disable it. It probably should have been, this is a legacy problem, but it probably should have been under the show rule and not the enable rule. But here we are. So that's why the book has examples on like which rules are in use depending on which integration point you're using. And obviously the ribbon has both. This interactive section, the rules appear on all the way up to like the ribbon. So if you wanted to let's say, have a bunch of buttons all appear at the same time, rather than trying to add the rules to each PowerShell script, you could add it to like the root level if you wanted to, or somewhere in between, and those rules get evaluated before it shows it. Now, in this particular case, the ribbon, we want to only show if the user is an administrator, or they're a member of the local administrator's role. And the new thing is, or they have delegated access. And then we're going to enable it when it's locked, but not locked by me, and I have write access. So we don't, in some cases, we don't want to give too much access. We want, like, for example, if the user would not have write access to the item, even if they could lock it, then why even give them the ability to unlock it, right? So you wanna think through, like, what is logical for this scenario. Um, if we come back to here, you can see that Michael West doesn't have write access to this item. So I wouldn't give Michael the ability to unlock it because he can't even write it. So it's like he's going to go unlock it, and then what? Now, maybe you want to just give somebody the power to unlock, and that's all they do. It's like they're not going to go change anything, they just want to unlock it. You could certainly go about that, but that would be kind of pointless to do that. But you can see here on this home item that I do have write access, so that warning doesn't appear. But what does appear is that it's locked by an admin, and I've enabled the gutter menu so that you can just conveniently see that it is locked by admin. Okay, so enough about that. We've got rules. The rules are ways for you to toggle visibility, to restrict access. The rules apply to reports. It applies to practically every visual integration point that is here, and so you want to take advantage of that. Also consider performance. If prior to having the rules in place, imagine every time you click on an item, I'm a content editor. Every time I click on an item, a script had to run to evaluate whether or not it should do something. That would provide probably a terrible experience to the content editor. So these rules get evaluated before scripts run. So as long as the rules evaluate to true, which in a situation where you have no rules, then that would obviously evaluate to true. So if we look, for example, the some of these reporting, actually that's not what I wanted to go to. Let's see the test. You can see I've created a sample report. Uh, this one says, hey, do they have delegated access? But then the report folder and the actual report, they have no rules. And so as long as this evaluates to true, then everything else just runs. Yeah, so we've got rules on integration scripts, but when I, Michael West, log in, I don't see anything. Okay, so this is where the delegated access comes into play. So what we're going to do first is we're going to click on the delegated access, and we're going to insert a new PowerShell delegated access. Now this uses the insert item integration point, which is where you can essentially do what you would do with insert options. So you use the rules on it to restrict, whether that even appeared or not. But rather than the traditional show me a window, type in an item name, and create it, it runs an entire script to do whatever it is that you want to do. And so here you could perform all sorts of operations, and even go as far as to say make use of the delegated access functionality to allow someone to use the insert item to go create things in places where they wouldn't normally have access to see. So what are we going to call this? We're going to call this elevated unlock. And oh, you know what? This was actually supposed to be a checkbox. So this is probably an old version of the module. I'm testing on a different machine. actually what we want is this. This is supposed to be a checkbox, and I can show you how we can fix that here in a moment. And so, partly why I wanted to use this dialog was the role selection and the user selection. In the content editor, there is no field type to be able to do this. Right? You get like single line text, you get rich text fields, you get all sorts of fields, but you don't actually get a role selector, which is it's kind of interesting. But in SPE, in the read variable command, you can get this dialog where you add that. So here we're going to we want to add a role. Now in this particular case, the role that I want doesn't exist. So we'll cancel out of that, and we'll take a step back and say, well, what what do we need when we want to make use of this feature? Well, you need to have the role that you want to use. You have to have a user that you want to impersonate. So I'm going to execute this code as some super user. Then that user also needs to exist. So we'll come back and we'll go to the role manager, and we're going to create a new role. We're going to call this elevated unlock under the Sitecore domain. Okay. And at the moment, I don't actually need to add this to any other role. We don't need any additional inheritance, but you could certainly do that given your particular requirement. And then we're going to add a user to that. So we're going to add Michael to that role. Okay. And we're just going to make use of the out-of-the-box admin account. So let's go through this again. We'll do elevated unlock. We're going to choose that elevated unlock role will receive the extra access. And then we're going to impersonate the admin. Okay. So in your instance, you might have a different account altogether. You might have decided that we don't want to use the admin air quote account. We're going to create a user that basically has access to everything. Maybe they're in the local administrators group, whatever. The reason why I had to do this impersonation is because there's no real convenient way to say, Michael's in the elevated unlock role, but I want to treat it like he's in the local administrator's role. Sitecore doesn't really have that. They just have context users, and then based on the user, there's like a lookup for which roles that they're in. And so in the magic of PowerShell extensions, there's ways for me to run this code as a different context user. So we're going to go through SPE. We're going to pick the elevated unlock to be elevated in our scenario, delegated access. So it's under tools, security management. Do note that these icons are different. This one I think is like a coffee bean, and this one appears to be a private label jar that has nothing in it. When you see this particular icon, it means that the module is enabled. And when you see this other icon, it means that it is disabled. So there's several integration points where if it's disabled, they don't work. And so you want to be certain that when you, as an author of a tool, a module, whatever, that you ensure that they're enabled appropriately. When you go from enabled to disabled and vice versa, you'll want to rebuild the integration points because it will go delete or add things to the core database that are required. Okay, so we'll keep moving forward. So first, let's start with the content editor warning. Okay, so we save this. You see, it's supposed to be a check, so we'll go ahead. I'll leave it disabled for a second, just so that you can see. So I click on this item, and you see nothing has changed for this user. So it's important that you can go quickly disable this feature because If something isn't working right, you want to be able to quickly remove the access for everybody without actually doing a bunch of changes. Like I just need an on-off switch. So I'm going to go turn it on. And now I have the elevated unlock button. And if I want to unlock it, then all I've got to do is just click this and it will run PowerShell code to go unlock this item. Um, Furthermore, I want now a button up here because it's convenient to have a ribbon button for that. So I can come down to here and I can say, let's go create this other script. We've created the other script in advance. So then I come to Tools, Ribbon. Okay. Kind of unfortunate that the names aren't distinguished differently, but it only matters to someone who's editing this. So I'll come back to here, and what we should see now is a security tab. And now I get this button here, right? So what we've done is we've made sure that someone who's going to use this has been properly configured, and then we granted them that extra access. So if I removed Michael West from the role, then this should vanish as well. So let's try that just to see if I'm correct or not. We'll go to Michael West, member. We're going to remove Michael from the elevated unlock, and the buttons have disappeared, right? So all these things work in tandem. And now that I've put this in place, then when the content editor is saying, hey, I need to be able to unlock items for people in my team, then you can just go add them to the role, and bada bing, bada boom, they're able to do that. So this problem has come up in my company several times, and so originally this elevated unlock was a feature in which um, it wasn't an out of the box feature. It was just something I added to our solution, but it required the user to be added to the local administrator's role because that's the only way, as far as I recall, that's the only role you can add someone to that would give them this extra access to unlock items. But adding someone to the local administrator's role gives them more access than they actually need. So it's like I just want them to have that one thing, unlock items for other content editors. I don't want to give them the ability to go manage access for other users. So you could see how a good idea could then turn into creating a security risk, right? If you follow the least privileges approach, you want to give as little access as required to perform that job, right? You've probably heard crazy stories about, uh, the CEO or the CIO or whoever getting some phishing email, and they click on something and now they take down a whole company, right? Take down the infrastructure because they they did something that they shouldn't have done, and they had more access than they should have had, and then boom, things fall apart. Now, not to say that that's really a high risk in a Sitecore context, but the risk is still there, and so we want to limit that risk. Okay, so Michael's been added back to the elevated unlock, and now Michael can see those buttons again. Okay, so the next example would be the reports. So if I go back to the reports, the custom reports, which has no security around it, no rules around it, I can see. But I want to provide Michael the ability to go see these extra reports. So once again, what you can do is go create a new role. So we'll do a role manager, and we're going to create a new role called Power Reports. maybe power user reports. I don't know, you could, whatever you want to call it. Okay, so now that role exists, so I can switch over to power user reports. So I get some Chrome extension. When I click on something, it gives me the definition. Okay, so we're going to add members and we're going to switch to users. We're going to add Michael to this. Okay, so now Michael is in the power user reports. Okay, well, that doesn't really change anything yet. So I come here and I go to reports. This is the test report that I've set up. You can see that reports, this root level for the integration has a rule that says where the current user has delegated access. If you're curious about that, delegated access is a rule included with SPE. There are other rules that SPE includes. You'll see those under PowerShell. So like the current user is a member of a specific role, either directly or through inheritance. I needed that because it wasn't a convenient rule that existed out of the box. You see ISC specific ones, and then like other session specific ones. So you could control, like in the reports where they have little action buttons, you could control the visibility of those things. You can control if we're not using a persistent session, then certain things don't work. And so there's just a lot of different things that are included with SPE that would take too much time to try and describe today. Okay, so we don't need to create a rule. You can see that this is already defined on the item. Okay, so we're going to go back to the delegated access. Okay, and ignore the broken checkbox for a moment. And we're going to call this power user reporting. You could call it whatever you want. Then we've got the elevated role. So we're going to elevate this role, power user reports. And we're going to impersonate, once again, the admin. But once again, in your scenario, you might want to create a different user. The password's not required. It simply gets the user and runs the scripts as that user authenticated. Okay, so we switch down to tests and we're gonna do this reports. So this is the minimally required because I've put the rule on reports. I add that here. So then I come back here and what happened? It's disabled. And it works. Okay. And so then I go run the sample report and you can see that this report was generated by Michael West. So then you see I got one item, this report was ran as Michael West. So if I close that up, and the next thing I want to do is I want to make this report run as the elevated user. So we'll come back to here and we'll switch to here and we're gonna add sample report as well. Okay, so there's a key piece of detail to keep in mind. There are PowerShell script items and PowerShell libraries, PowerShell script library items that you may apply the rules to. And so if you apply a rule to it, you'll want to select it into this multi-list box here. If you want it to run elevated, it definitely needs to be in here, right? So for example, if I need someone to have access to the ribbon, then I could add the ribbon, the top level ribbon to this, and it will then make it available to them. But then if I wanted to run as this user, the script that's running definitely needs to be in here. Okay, so we come back to here and you can see now that the report was generated by admin. And also, there are 2 items. Okay, delete me. So if you say, well, why is there 2 items in this report, but there was only 1 in the previous report? Well, if we go back to here, you can see that on the security details for that item, I denied access to my user, Michael West. So this demonstrates that when running scripts, it may not be sufficient to rely on that user's current access. Okay, so in this particular report, let's say I wanted the report to have a button up here that lets me delete items, but the user would be unable to go navigate through the tree. Maybe it exists under system settings, or maybe it's restricted where we don't want people fiddling around with that. We only want them to see the 5 items that they're allowed to see. Whatever your scenario is, if the user would not have had access, in this case, to even see the item, I can now see the item because the report ran as an elevated user, and the elevated user has access to it. So this might apply to you, and it might not. It just depends on really what scenario you want. And to change the behavior was as simple as either adding this report to it or not. The same would go for like if you had the PowerShell actions. So if you ever see these like internal um, PowerShell script library items, and then list view ribbon, what this will do is it will create a button that appears in the report. Okay, so you can see that uh, this only appears where the view is called locked items, in a locked items view. And if we say, well, what does that really mean? Well, if I go to the report and you go to locked items, let me scroll down to where you can see it. Okay, when you create reports, one of the parameters to the show list view command is view name. So the view that I've created for this is called locked items. If I go to the report action, or anything that you would have a report on, rule on, if but in this it applies really in this case. I have a button that I want to appear in the report. I set a rule that says locked items view, which matches what pops up. So what does that really mean? Well, if I come to let's see, security audit, locked items, and yep, just go with the default, you can see that these buttons appear. So you could add these script items to the delegated access, and those should run as the higher privileged account as well. Okay, so we've done a ribbon, we've done a content editor warning, we've made the reports visible based on delegated access, we've made the report run with the impersonated account. Then we can have the report actions run with the delegated account. And so now you've kind of closed the loop and said, well, if I can see the data, I can also edit the data, but only through this tool, right? Because once again, you might not want to use the elevated unlock, but you might give someone access to this so they can just go unlock items. So I had said before that it might not be useful to give someone just access to unlock items, but this is a scenario in which we have made that possible. If you gave someone access to this report, the delegated access, which we could go try that real quick. So I want to do this locked items report. Let's see. So actually, I don't think these reports, this one probably, yeah, see, this one doesn't contain a rule for that. So I'll show you just changing that real easily. So I actually should make this one have that as well out of the box. So here you can see I now have made it possible for delegated access. Okay, so then I come back to this one here, and we're going to add the PowerShell reporting here. Okay, so it's going to be this reports item. So once again, the names are kind of unfortunate here. Maybe the display name could be updated. Mm, yeah, that might be useful. And I'm going to go to this user now. And now the security audit appears. So this is just a couple examples, and they are security focused on getting that access. But when it comes to any tool that you're creating, if you maybe have certain lines of business and you only give someone access to that line of business, but you want them to be able to do something a super user would do because they have a partnership with the other lines of business, other brands, and they kind of control that, control whatever that feature might be. Maybe this is you built a tool that's going to do a data sync between a hiring software or some data import, and you want somebody to be able to go troubleshoot it without the admin having to be there. You could build a tool that lets them troubleshoot, but they don't actually have the, the admin or the developer access to do it. The tool does. Right. Well, that's the bulk of the delegated access. I could talk a little bit more about the items as resources, but that's that's just the packaging. Any questions around the feature that I've shown so far? Okay, I'll have a look at something, and if questions come up, you're welcome to throw them my way. I just want to make sure that um, when you're looking for something to download for SPE, that you're looking in the right place. So the marketplace is no longer used, and I think today when you go to the marketplace for Sitecore, it redirects you. So what we have here is a releases page on GitHub, and you can see that the packages have SHA 256 values stamped here. You'll see that exists for previous versions as well. The importance of this is if you download the file and the hash doesn't match, it could have been tampered with. And so by providing you this, it's a way to say this is definitely the same package. Now, if for some reason we created a 6.4.1, but someone maybe renamed the file, then the hashes won't match, and then you're like, hey, there's a problem here. So you want to come to GitHub and get the proper version. Okay, so why are there several versions? So the IAR is suitable for Sitecore 10, where the items as resources feature was introduced. I think maybe 10.1, but really anybody using 10.2 should be using one of these two packages. Now the just the regular zip ones, so this one and this one, are your standard Sitecore package where it's this zip. Inside is another zip called package.zip, and inside of that has some proprietary folder structure of files and items. Because of the IAR functionality, um, items don't need to be installed. So if you're using 10.2 and later, then this is going to be your ideal version to use. I think if you're on 10.1, there's a particular configuration that needs to be applied so that it looks for the items in the right location. But otherwise, IAR for 10.2 is going to be the way to go. You can see that the package is actually smaller, 1.81 megabytes versus 5. So that should be something worth considering. Now the SCWDP, these have been generated with the Sitecore Azure Toolkit. I think it's what it's called, SAC. This is a tool designed for probably a bunch of different things, but it can be used to convert Sitecore packages into Sitecore web deployed packages. And these are going to contain the DAC packs. If you have security that need to be added into the database, then the DAC packs are going to be required. And then all the other things that are necessary. So this is useful in scenarios where you want to automate the deployment. So for example, I had this automation step where Sitecore gets installed in my Docker container, and I've got these scripts here. One runs on the CM, one runs on the SQL instance, the MSQL SQL instance, and it simply takes packages out of my releases folder and then runs the SQL package executable, and that will install those items. So when I'm developing locally and I want to test a new version of SPE, I can dump the package into this folder, start up Docker, the Docker containers with Docker Compose, and it at some point it will install in the database and it will install the items. Now, the current version of SPE, there's only one DAC pack, and that's for the security roles. So when this step runs, it's only going to install the user and role that come with SPE. But when you install, but when this is installed, then it's going to do everything that would be in a standard file copy kind of deployment, right? It's going to have all the configs, DLLs, scripts, everything that comes with SPE, but there are no items, air quote items. They're all stored in the DAT file, the IAR DAT file. Well, wonderful. I could go on all day about this, but any questions?
Yeah,
Yeah.
we have one question in chat window. So question is delegate access is part of 6.4 version. Can we achieve it in old versions as well?
Um, there's no way to conveniently backport it into an older version. If you wanted to do that, you'd really have to um, like get an older version and rebuild it with this functionality. And the reason why it wouldn't be conveniently supported is because um, one, there's a new data template. Two, in places where code has to be executed as this extra user, um, I have to go look up and then switch the user for the job that runs the PowerShell code. So what do I mean by that? If you actually looked at the issue, you'll see all these commits that I've made. One of the changes has to do with when the job is there's a how do I say this? There's a Sitecore job that runs, and when that job runs in the background for some of these integrations, it then has to switch the user to run it as that elevated user. So you can see here that we go look up the delegated user that's configured. And so there's just too much that's in place for you to really conveniently put that in an older version. But SPE should still be supported on version 8. So it would make more sense for you to just upgrade and make use of the feature than it would be to go through any trouble to try to make it work on an older version. Yeah. And if you, yeah, I was gonna say if you're more interested in the inner workings of how I got this going, we could certainly have a discussion on Sitecore Slack.